Welcome again this afternoon to our webinar on ISA Prep, 3D item analysis and strategies for student readiness. We're super excited to have you. And as promised, I shall go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. Prior to coming to Inner Orbit, I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years in Minnesota. I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught honors chem, regular chem, so lots of ways to teach a lot of different kids. I worked a lot with the NGSS during my time in the classroom, and I was also a PLC lead, so I got to lead a lot of data-driven dialogue, which is my favorite. And now I get to partner with districts to help them implement Inner Orbit. And fun fact, with this cold weather, my family just came back from a Disney cruise last week. And so we docked in Florida and it was about 80. And then when I landed at home in Minnesota, it was -20. So I had the joy of experience a 100-degree difference in weather in one day. And with that, I'll go ahead and have Julia introduce herself.
Well, I think that must have been a cold shock for your body. But hi, everyone. My name is Julia Mota. I was a teacher and a tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic, and I've been supporting teachers and districts with their NGSS implementation for the past 4 years. I've been a partner in providing guidance to schools and districts implementing assessments in their NGSS instruction within Orbit. And as I told you before, I've never experienced cold like this in my life. I lived in the Dominican Republic for a while. Then I moved to Miami. And then is when I moved to Chicago, moving to Minnesota next. So maybe I'm jinxing it and it might be colder next year. So I'll be in the chat just answering your questions. I'll pass it over to Daniel for him to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Daniel Jackson. I was previously a curriculum director, high school biology and middle school science teacher, totaling 11 years in education. I taught at an international school in Colombia. I was a global education and Fulbright TGC scholar in Morocco, and I currently partner with school leaders and teachers new to Inner Orbit. And I was born and raised in Ohio, but I'm not used to this. This one's a special one. I don't know how often this one comes around. And I shoveled like 5 times since Saturday, and I never know when it's going to stop. So from here, but I don't like it. And what we'll move on next is our agenda. I'm going to cover what we'll go over today. Our goal is to cover the structure and the expectations of the Illinois Science Assessment, the ISA, be able to identify the NGSS dimensions within the ISA items, and learn how scaffolded formative assessments can support students' progression towards confidently answering 3D phenomena-driven questions. We'll be together for about 45 minutes. First, I'll go over, give an overview of Inner Orbit. Next, we'll cover the shift to sense making and talk through assessments that align with the ISA. From there, we'll go over the ISA structure and item analysis, along with an example of scaffolded formatives from Inner Orbit that can help teachers prepare students for the ISA. We will also provide a helpful classroom resource for phenomena-based questions towards the end. So with that, get started we shall, which is my terrible impression of Yoda. I apologize to any real Star Wars fans out there, especially to my colleague Emily. But that's all I got, as I don't know much about Star Wars. I just know about Yoda's speech patterns. All right, to kick us off, I'll begin with a quick introduction to what Inner Orbit is and how it supports educators. At Inner Orbit, we like to say there are 3 core components to what we do. We have phenomena, we have assessments, and we have our high integrity 3D assessments at Inner Orbit are designed to provide meaningful and actionable student data so educators can make informed instructional decisions with confidence. We also make the NGSS accessible for both you and your students through innovative approaches to sense making. That means we don't just drop students straight into these complex 3D questions. Instead, we use scaffolded prompts that move students from more basic one-dimensional content-focused understanding towards those larger 3-dimensional questions, which we'll talk more about in just a bit. In addition to the questions themselves, we also provide supporting activities you can use with your students to help build that understanding over time so that they're prepared and confident when they reach those more rigorous summative assessments later on, such as on the ISA. We also provide guidance, supporting resources, and professional development to help you reach your NGSS goals, just like this session we're doing here today. If you're interested in learning more about Inner Orbit, feel free to fill out the interest form, and from there, we'll share additional information and show you how you all can try Inner Orbit within your districts. Next, I want to talk about the shift to sense making in regards to how we can interpret proficiency when prepping for the ISA. If you've been teaching for years, you've probably felt this huge shift already. Proficiency has moved from standards that often focused on isolated facts, content, or skills to performance expectations that describe what students should actually be able to do to demonstrate understanding. Under the NGSS, proficiency is defined by sense making, which is when students integrate the 3 dimensions to explain phenomena and solve problems not just recall information. Let's now take a look at what those three dimensions of the NGSS are. As you may know, the three dimensions are what sit at the heart of the NGSS. First, we have the disciplinary core ideas. These are the content, the science students are learning. In this example on the screen, the DCI we're focusing on is adaptation. Students need to be able to understand that in a given habitat, some organisms survive well, some survive less well, and some cannot survive at all. That understanding is a critical part of the content students are expected to learn, although on its own, that kind of recall is no longer sufficient to say a student is proficient. The second dimension is the science and engineering practices. This is what students are actually doing with the science. Practices include things like constructing arguments, analyzing data, and developing or using models. In other words, thinking and acting like scientists. In this performance expectation, students are asked to engage in argument from evidence, meaning they must construct a claim and support it with evidence based on what they've learned about adaptation. And finally, we have the cross-cutting concepts. These are the big ideas that are connected across scientific disciplines. They shape how students think about science. Examples include patterns, systems, and cause and effect. In the example here, the cross-cutting concept is cause and effect, and students need to reason through how certain traits or conditions in a habitat cause some organisms to survive better than others. When all three of these dimensions come together, we get a much clearer picture of what the students truly understand. We're no longer just measuring what they can memorize, we're assessing how they think, reason, and apply their knowledge. And that's a key difference with three-dimensional sense-making focused assessments. Next, let's talk a little bit more about sense-making. So when we say sense-making, we're talking about what happens when students pull together everything they already know, their ideas, their skills, and their experiences to make sense of something they don't fully understand yet. That process usually begins with a phenomena that's puzzling and raises questions. From there, students might use science and engineering practices to investigate. They may ask questions, analyze data, or construct explanations, while at the same time drawing on disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts. As we see in the image, sense-making isn't expected to be linear. Students won't always move step by step in a straight line. Instead, they move back and forth between practices, content, and cross-cutting concepts as they refine their understanding. Rather than just jumping straight to the right answer, they're working to figure out why something is happening. They're testing ideas, revising their thinking, and asking better questions along the way. That really is what the NGSS is aiming for, and what we believe strong assessments and strong instruction should be designed to support. Students that show proficiency are able to bring all of these pieces together to make sense of new or novel scenarios. Now that we've gone over sense making, I'll pass it over to Emily to show you how sense making is incorporated into the ISA.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. We always like to just do a little bit of recap over some of those NGSS foundations and fundamentals before we just start saying a bunch of letters, DCI, SCP, PE, the NGSS, which is an alphabet soup. All right. So we're here to talk about the ISA. So to give you a really high level idea of the ISA, in case you're unfamiliar, there's going to be 3 sections on the ISA. There's going to be 32 items in each section, and there's going to be 30 multiple choice and 2 constructed response per section. Students are going to have about 40 minutes for each section, and within each section, there's going to be 4 clusters. These clusters are grouped around a phenomena. So there's going to be a phenomena that students are going to be interacting with to answer those questions. So when we're looking at the type of information that's going to actually be on the ISA, this is the blueprint for the 5th grade ISA. The first thing I want to point out is the different performance expectations that are listed, and the fact that they are all 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade standards. So the 5th grade ISA is going to be comprehensive of all those elementary grade level bands, and it's going to have earth and space science, life science, and physical science on it. It's also going to have all of the 8 SEPs, and it's going to have all of the 7 cross-cutting concepts as well. Now, the questions on the ISA are always going to have either an SEP or a CCC embedded within the question, which means all of the questions are going to be 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, meaning all the questions will have some DCI, some content component, but then they're going to either layer on the science and engineering practice or the cross-cutting concept, or more often than not, both. So students are going to need to be able to answer 3-dimensional questions and use all 3 of those dimensions confidently when trying to answer questions. The same is true on the 8th grade ISA. So again, what I want to point out here is that this has got all of the middle school standards on it. So while these performance expectations within your school or district might be broken down by 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. All of those middle school level PEs will be assessed. Same thing with all 8 science and engineering practices and all 7 cross-cutting concepts. And again, they're all going to be 2D and 3D questions. So when we're thinking about supporting students for the ISA, one thing that I like to kind of zoom out and recommend is spending time focusing on those SEPs and those CCCs. Because I don't know about you, but that list of DCIs, those PEs, is very long. But there's only 8 SEPs and 7 CCCs, and those are going to be embedded within every question. So really helping students focus on those skills within the SEPs and the cross-cutting concepts and the ways of thinking and rationalizing problems could be really foundational in helping them answer those 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional items. Another thing that I want to talk about is ISA cut scores. So what this means is if you've had the pleasure of going on the Illinois Department of Education website, you can find the different scores that students need to get in order to get either an above proficient, proficient, approaching proficient, or below proficient score. What we've done here at Inner Orbit to help interpret this is we've translated these into cut scores or percentages, because us as teachers deal in 90, 80, 70%, and we don't necessarily deal with 900s and 700s. So as you can see here, students at most can earn 900 points and at minimum can earn 700 points on the ISA for both 5th and 8th grade, which means there is a total of 200 points that they can earn. In order to be proficient, the minimum score that students have to earn is 812. So remember, the minimum is 700, the max is 900. They have to score at least 812 to be proficient. In other words, they need to be able to earn 112 points to be proficient. If there's 200 points to be earned and they need to score at least 112 to be proficient, that comes out to a proficiency of 56%. Now, we like to take the time to highlight this because I don't know about you, but I have been trained whenever I see 56% to think that it is failing. But in terms of these rigorous 3-dimensional assessments, getting 56% of the potential points would actually earn students a proficient score. So if you are giving students either inner orbit items or rigorous 3-dimensional items or anything like this to help them prep for the ISA, keep in mind this different lens in which you should look at this proficiency. 56% could be considered proficient. So your students don't need to be getting those 80, 90% of questions correct in order to be displaying that proficiency when taking the ISA. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at data and results. All right, now that we have a little bit of an understanding of how the ISA is structured, what types of questions are going to be on it, what I want to do now is take some time to actually analyze an 8th grade practice item. And what I want to do here is I want to highlight how this item is 3-dimensional. And then from there, I want to show how you can give students scaffolded questions to help them prepare for a 3-dimensional question like the one that we're about to analyze. So the performance expectation or the standard that this item is assessing is MSLS 4.4, which is all about constructing explanations based on evidence, that's the SAP, that describe how genetic variations of traits in a population increase some individuals' probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. So this idea of natural selection. And the cross-cutting concept is cause and effect. So how different traits can cause survival in certain organisms. So these 3 dimensions are going to be taking place within this one item that students will need to answer. Another thing I wanted to highlight here is the ISA will also has these performance level descriptors. And what this does is it'll look at a performance expectation, a standard like MSLS 4.4, and it'll tell you what students have to do in order to be considered proficient on that standard. So in order to be proficient for MSLS 4.4, students need to be able to explain, based on evidence, how genetic variations of traits and populations increase some individuals' probability of surviving and reproducing in a specific environment. I would like to highlight how similar that is to the actual performance expectation that we are measuring. All of this to say, if you are teaching students the different skills embedded within the 3 dimensions of a performance expectation of a standard, you are helping that student being able to earn a proficient on that standard on the ISA. So if we're ensuring that they're using that SEP correctly, they understand natural selection, they understand the idea of cause and effect, we're helping them reach that proficient score. From there, let's talk about the actual item. So this is the phenomena for the item. It's about white clover plants. White clover plants cause leaves to produce a poison. Herbivores avoid eating white clovers because the poison gives the plants a bitter taste. Scientists have collected data on the number of poisonous and non-poisonous white clovers in areas with low and high human population densities. Figure 1 shows the white clover plant. Figure 2 shows the percentage of poisonous white clover plants in relation to human population density. So this would be the phenomena on the ISA that students would refer to. And here's their question. This is a constructed response question. Remember, they have to do 2 constructed responses in each of the 3 sections on the ISA. So students need to answer these questions. How does producing poison affect the survival of white clovers in areas with large populations of herbivores? Describe one piece of evidence that supports your answer. And predict the percentage of non-poisonous white clovers in areas with a high human population density. I got a bad feeling about this, Joey. I'm the Star Wars nerd, if you didn't figure that out from earlier. So please enjoy my sporadic Star Wars gifts as we go through. This is a hefty question. Students need to form a constructed response, so write something on their own, and they have to address 3 different prompts within this phenomena about these white clover plants. So what I want to do next is I want to have us take a moment to see how these 3 different dimensions are actually interacting with this item. So we can then see how we can support our students with these 3 dimensions to help them then make sense of items on their own later on. So first thing I want to do is let's see if we can identify how the SEP is taking a part of this phenomena. So as we see, the SEP is constructing explanations and designing solutions. That's what students have to do. More specifically, they have to construct an explanation that includes qualitative or quantitative relationships between variables that describe phenomena. Well, it looks like here that the graph is going to be my qualitative or quantitative relationship and the variables at play that are going to help me describe what's going on with the white clover plants. So in order to construct the explanation and design solutions and use the SEP, students are going to have to come up with this claim. Okay, so how does producing poison affect the survival of white clover? So that's their claim that they have to make. And then they have to describe a piece of evidence to support that claim. In this case, they're going to have to reference the graph. So they're going to have to look at the graph and extrapolate evidence from the graph to support their claim of the white clover survival. So this is how students are going to need to incorporate the SEP when trying to answer this question. But like I mentioned, this is a 3-dimensional question. It's not just the SEP. Students also need to use the disciplinary core idea or the content of natural selection. So specifically, natural selection leads to the predominance of certain traits in a population and the suppression of others. So students have to understand how producing poison affects the survival of white clovers. So how this trait of poison will then affect how it survives within this population. And then also how non-poisonous are going to be affected in their survival as well. The last thing students have to do within this is the cross-cutting concept, which is cause and effect. In this case, they have to see how producing poison affects the survival of these white clovers. So as you can see, students are going to need to incorporate their being able to construct explanations, making claims, writing evidence. They have to understand natural selection, and they have to see how cause and effect takes place within that natural selection to help them make that claim with evidence. It's a lot. So before we move on and talk about how you can actually scaffold questions to help students answer questions at that rigor, I just wanted a quick recap. On the ISA, there's going to be 3 sections. So 32 items each, 30 multiple choice, 2 constructed response. They get 40 minutes for each section, 4 clusters per section. Remember, they're going to be only asked 2D and 3D questions, which means there's going to be an SEP and or a CCC within all of those questions. And also keep in mind, as you're helping students with this, that we're looking for that proficiency of about 56%. So when it comes to thinking about how to support students, supporting them with the SCPs and the CCCs is a great start because that's something they're going to encounter with throughout the ISA. And as you're helping prepare students and you're giving them potential practice items, keep in mind that that proficiency mark is about 56%. So if they're answering a little bit more than half of them right, we're doing a good job, and so are they. All right, so that was a beefy question, right, about the white clovers. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about how we can scaffold students through questioning to get them to be able to answer a more rigorous question like that and like what they're going to see on the ISA. Because this is kind of the shift to sense making that Daniel was talking about earlier. This idea that standards used to be all about content and all about information. And now we've been making the shift to this 3-dimensional learning where students have to incorporate their skills and their thinking as well. And like Han says, never tell me the odds because we can do this. All right, we can complete the Kessel run in 12 parsecs or get students to answer 3-dimensional questions. By doing the way that we do this here at Inner Orbit is we've written questions that slowly scaffold up to three-dimensional rigor. So as you know, we've got the three different dimensions here. The first type of question you're going to find on inner orbit are what we call our one-dimensional questions. These are questions just on the DCI or just on content. So this is like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell kind of question. Now, it's crucial that we move students beyond one-dimensional questions, but it's also crucial that they know the content and the information. So one-dimensional questions are good to make sure that our students understand the basic content of the standard. From there, we can shift them to two-dimensional questions. This is where they still are being held responsible for the content, but now we're going to layer on either the cross-cutting concept or the SCP into the question. This is nice because it gives students a chance to flex those skills independently. And then on the Inner Orbit website, it's nice because it gives you incremental data on how they're doing on those individual dimensions before we ask them to do three-dimensional questions. And like Daniel mentioned, in answering a three-dimensional question is what the NGSS would consider to be proficient. So being able to incorporate all three dimensions with a novel phenomena is what we're going to be aiming for in terms of proficiency. But helping students slowly scaffold their way up to those three dimensions gives them a chance to practice those dimensions independently and gives you important data along the way to help you figure out what dimensions they may need more support with. So we're going to be looking at MSLS 4.4 again. So this is the exact same standard that white clover question was asking. And I'm going to be showing you some different questions on the Inner Orbit website that could help scaffold and lead up to that three-dimensional rigor like we saw in that white clover question. The phenomena on Inner Orbit that I pulled is called, how are these birds shaping snail populations? So this is all about how there are two different birds in Costa Rica, and and those birds will eat different shells. They will vary in size and color based on the bird's hunting habits. And then we have some graphs here showing us the size of the snails and the color by these two different birds, the limpkins and the snail kites. So knowing that students are going to interact with this phenomena, a question that we could ask our students to help scaffold them to that three-dimensional learning is, if a snail lives longer, it's blank to be able to blank. Remember, the standard here is MSLS 4.4. So the SCP is constructing explanations and designing solutions, the DCI is natural selection, and the CCC is cause and effect. So question for all of you, audience participation. Do you think this question is a 1D, a 2D, or a 3D question? Do you think this question is 1D, 2D, or 3D? All right, we got 2D. All right, I totally see why you guys said 2D. And honestly, this is why I love the participation. So on our site, we flagged this as 1D. Why? Because this is looking at the idea of natural selection. So this idea that if it lives longer, it is more likely to pass on its genes. But this is also kind of cause and effect, right? So this idea that living longer will cause it to pass on its genes. So sometimes the DCI and the CCC are really muddled together because that CCC is like a foundational science concept, which is embedded within a lot of the science that we do. So at least on our site, we classify this as one-dimensional. The other reason too is we're not really asking them to interact with the phenomena yet. So this is just kind of a basic recall of, do we understand what natural selection is? From there, let's look at another question. So same phenomena, but now our question is this. Based on figure 4, which of these statements correctly describes the likely effect of snail kites on future snail populations? Do you think this is 1D, 2D, or 3D? So on our site, we have labeled this as a two-dimensional question, the DCI plus CCC. The reason why is they still have to understand this idea of natural selection because this is going to affect the snail population. Right. So this genetic factor of the light colored scales versus the darker colored snails is going to affect the population of the snails. So cause and effect. But then this is also natural selection, right? So this idea that over time, lighter snails are going to be eaten, which will affect the population of lighter shelled snails within the future. All right, another question here for you. Refer to figure 3. A classmate states that the size of the shell does not impact a snail's ability to survive. Do you agree with the claim about the snail size? Do you think this is 1D, 2D, or 3D? Yes, and this is specifically a 2D SCP question. So as you can see here, they're not being asked to make a claim, but they're being asked to agree with a claim or not. and they have to refer to figure 3. So they have to look at some evidence to see if they agree with the claim that is being made or not. So in this case, they're looking at that SEP of constructing explanations and designing solutions. Now for a 3-dimensional question. Refer to the information in figure 4 and the graph above. Your class collected the data shown above on a population of snails living amongst snail kites. Which claim best explains the change in the snail population from year 1 to year 2? Do we think this is 1D? This is, in fact, 3-dimensional. So this is multiple choice. And so what students have to do is they have to say which claim best explains the change in snail population. So again, we're looking at that change in population. So we're looking at natural selection. We have to look at the graphs to help support our answer. And we're looking at this cause and effect because the population of dark snails increased because, cause and effect, they were able to survive long enough. And I bet you can see where this is going. A final question for us to look at. How does the snail population provide an example of natural selection? Use evidence from the figures and text to explain how certain traits may affect a snail's probability of surviving and reproducing in this environment. For the sake of time, this is a 3-dimensional constructed response question. So what I just showed you here was a series of questions that slowly scaled up in rigor from 1D to 2D to 3D and could help scaffold students to eventually be able to answer a question like this or a question like the white clovers. If we just throw a question like this for students, it's intimidating. There's a lot that they have to look at. There's a lot they have to digest, what's going on. But if we slowly give them those initial questions to begin with, we're slowly scaffolding them into, okay, I've got to look at the graphs. Okay, I have to look at cause and effect. Okay, wait, what is natural selection again? And as we do that for them, what we're doing is we're eventually helping them to eventually do this on their own. So by giving them 1-dimensional questions and getting them to think about the content, giving them 2-dimensional questions and giving them a chance to practice them on their own, putting them together in a multiple choice question first so they have a little bit more support before eventually asking them to write their own constructed response at the end. And then again, what's nice with this is this on Inner Orbit, you get this incremental data to also help see how your students are going through this progression as well. But before we talk about the data, I just wanted to give you an idea of what this could actually look like in your classroom. So let's say you are teaching the 8th grade unit on natural selection and common ancestry. And let's say you did a few lessons. You could then go on to the Inner Orbit website, and let's say you're using OpenSciEd. You could click that. You could click the natural selection and common ancestry unit. You could click formative because you want to do a little check-in and see how they're doing. And right here, you've got that snail phenomena and those snail questions. So this could be an opportunity midway through instruction, midway through a unit, give your students a scaffolded formative assessment and say, okay, how are they doing on 1D, 2D versus 3D? So then I can help figure out where I need to support them from there. This is a short form where you're essentially letting us know that you're interested in potentially trying out Inner Orbit. You can pilot on a really small scale with just your students, and you can explore the site and look at some phenomena and see if this would be helpful. You could also pilot on really large scales if you want to involve an entire team or an entire district into it, where you could really build assessments, gather data, and see if this is something that could work out for you. You're not making any commitment by filling out this form. The only thing that will happen is you will get an email that'll say, hey, you told us you were interested. Would you like to chat more? Or here's a link to learn some more as well. So feel free to fill that out if you would like to. From there, though, I keep talking about this awesome incremental data that you're going to get. And so Daniel is going to now take us through what that data could actually look like if you administered some of these assessments.
All right, thanks, Emily. Well, as we know in science, data is everything. So let's take a look at what the data can look like and the insights it provides when you give an assessment on Inner Orbit. Because all the Inner Orbit summative items are 2 or 3-dimensional, just like on the ISA, every question includes either a SEP or a cross-cutting concept or both. This allows teachers and admin to look beyond missed standards and to actually identify patterns across students, classrooms, and schools. The dimensions report here provides this insight by showing performance across the specific elements of each of the 3 dimensions and allowing you to drill down by grade, school, or class. This helps you target instruction, support learning across multiple performance expectations, and better align your preparation to state assessments like the ISA. Now let's zoom out to a district level view. This is one of my favorite reports because it really highlights why looking at the SEPs and the cross-cutting concepts are so important and so powerful. Across the top, you can see the different dimensions, and down the side, you can see the performance of different schools in your district. In this example, you can quickly see the differences between schools, such as School 2, struggling with the SEP of constructing explanations and designing solutions, while School of Five is performing much better in that same area. That contrast opens the door for meaningful collaboration, allowing educators to ask what's working in one school and how do those strategies and how can those strategies be shared across the district. Now let's zoom into the teacher level view and look at student performance on individual questions. In this example, we see that the students tend to do well on the 1D, DCI only questions, and continue to perform strongly on the 2D question where a cross-cutting concept is added. However, we begin to see a drop in the when the science and engineering practice is introduced in the other 2D question, and an even larger drop when we see when all three dimensions are included in the last question. Because that same SEP appears in both the 2D and the 3D questions, we can identify that as the key area where students need more targeted support rather than unnecessarily reviewing the DCI that they're already doing well on. That's the real power power of this data. It helps us move beyond just what students missed to focusing on why it was missed, so that instruction can be adjusted with intention. While assessment is a crucial component in helping students prepare for the ISA, Inner Orbit has also created some more informal sense-making activities to help students practice. I wanted to share one of those activities with you all called the Science Talks that helps students with targeting these supports in the classroom and can be implemented right away. In the Science Talks activity, students engage in a facilitated discussion around a novel phenomenon, exploring questions, sharing ideas, and collaboratively building understanding. Teachers would select a phenomena from our library, and students will work together to unpack it using all three dimensions, while they collaborate to highlight bigger patterns or relationships they notice. It's important to note that this activity is a scaffolded support and not another test. Once teachers see data that shows students are struggling with 3D questions, the next step could be to provide this type of structured sense-making practice in the classroom. Teachers can run science talks at any point of the year to help students become more confident making sense of phenomena out loud and together. By practicing this way, when students encounter a 3D question on an assessment like the ISA, it doesn't feel like an entirely new task. Instead, it's the same kind of thinking they've been practicing in class. These science talks promote collaborative sense-making and help students ask better questions and connect their prior knowledge to new concepts as they get prepared for the ISA. This can be a great informal first step for ISA preparation that can be implemented right away in the classroom. All right, that's all we have planned for today. I'm going to pass it off to Emily to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you so much for hanging out with us this afternoon. So just a quick recap. Today we wanted to talk about the structure and the expectations of the ISA and talk about how the three NGSS dimensions are within ISA items and how scaffolded formative assessments can help support students towards that progression of answering 3D questions confidently. Just as a reminder, SEPs and CCCs are going to be embedded within each item. So when it comes to figuring out how to support your students, ensuring that you're incorporating the SEPs and the CCCs in ISA review and instruction is a great place to start. Also, keeping in mind when you're looking at supporting your students, that proficiency on the ISA is about at that 56%. So you don't need students performing at that 80-90% when they're being asked these rigorous questions in order to make sure that they're on their way towards proficiency. All right, one more time, we're going to drop that interest form in the chat. Again, this is just an opportunity to let us know that you're potentially interested in learning more about Inner Orbit and potentially trying it out with your students and with your classroom. This can be done on a small or on a large scale. We also have a lot more videos like this on our YouTube channel. If you go to Inner Orbit NGSS on YouTube, you're going to find a ton of other webinars like this about the three dimensions, about the NGSS. And also, if you have any questions outside of that interest form, you're always able to email us at inquiries@innerorbit.com. And may the force be with you today. Thank you again for joining us. And please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or you want to have any discussions further.